Thank you, Kim, and our young Presbyterians. Wonderful illustration of a hard thing to accomplish, only by the grace of God. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from the Gospel of Luke, of course, as we continue this wide-ranging discourse that Jesus is having, both with the crowds and his disciples and a few Pharisees and scribes along the way. This one is directed to the disciples, the parable of the dishonest manager. Try to stay with me on this one. It's not the easiest thing. Lectionary seems to be asking us to hear some difficult passages to grow us in our ability to hear the good news through difficulty, right? I'm reaching now, work with me. So I'm reading the first 13 verses of chapter 16 in the Gospel of Luke. Hear now the word of the Lord for you and for me today. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Well, then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he said, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you, who have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our drawing prompt for our young artists today, please help us in understanding these passages that we've heard today by drawing whatever you would hate to lose. That could be a soccer game, a dance competition, a favorite toy, a favorite friend, whatever you would hate to lose. Because we're going to be going right into this universal human fear and universal human experience of loss. Jeremiah is often seen as the Debbie Downer of the Bible. Sorry, Hervey. You read that passage well. That is not an easy word to hear. Jeremiah's lament for the fall of Jerusalem. And then you pair it with the parable that we had from Luke. And y'all are going to get your money's worth, maybe, if I'm successful in proclaiming the good news today. But I do believe that the good news is always just beyond what we hear on the surface, what we see on the surface. God looks on the heart, right? So we're going to look into the heart of these passages to try to see what God might have in mind. But I was struck by how these two passages both put us in the context of loss. Loss in life is hard. I don't think even Presbyterians would disagree about that. Think about the losses that you have experienced in your life. Maybe you moved when you were a child. Your family moved away and you had to leave loved friends and a loved house behind. Maybe you have lost a pet who meant the world to you. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you've lost your house or your spouse or a marriage. Loss comes in as many different flavors as it does people. And yet, grief and lament that we experience after loss is something that binds us all, a universal experience. We all have been touched by loss because we're human. You cannot be alive on the planet and escape the experience. So it was with Jeremiah watching the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of its inhabitants to Babylon. If you've ever get the chance, and maybe some of you have, been to London and got a chance to visit the British Museum, they still have there the stone reliefs detailing the fall of Lachish, which was a city in the northern kingdom of Israel that was captured and destroyed by the Assyrian army around 700 BCE. This is 700 before Christ. It is among, and it might be, the earliest depiction of a mass deportation in the world. And it was preserved and captured that way because the Assyrian king was so proud of the way his army conducted itself in destroying the Hebrew people who lived in this city. And so when you stand there in front of these stone carvings stretched out, I don't know, about 6 feet tall, and you see the human loss played out right in front of you, it's very similar to what Jeremiah was talking about in the passage that Hervey read. You see prisoners on their knees begging for mercy. You see the ones who did not receive any mercy, who are tortured and killed by any means that we would consider barbaric today. You see refugees carrying everything that they own that they can manage to put on their shoulders or a cart, surrounded by soldiers, being led out of the city to a faraway place where they will be enslaved and forever seen as second-class citizens. That place was Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, Iraq. That's the scene that Jeremiah was witnessing, a similar scene. That's how they did it in the ancient Near East. Maybe Jeremiah was mourning his own loss. I am certain that he did. But when we hear the words that Hervey shared with us, we also heard how he mourned for the loss that his people experienced. It isn't just a list of all that he lost, it was a list of the people around him and what they were experiencing, weeping for their destruction, weeping for their hurt and displacement and having been widowed. He doesn't even crow over them that if they had just listened to him in the first place, this could have all been avoided. He doesn't tell them that he was right. He takes no satisfaction in the way this has all played out, even though God had given him the vision to have seen it coming. Whatever else Jeremiah lost, he kept his compassion. I like to think that he was able to do that because he never lost God in the midst of all the world coming down around him. So that was the loss that we hear from the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah's experience, and then in the parable of the dishonest manager, it's easy to overlook how this whole thing starts after the mismanagement is discovered. The dishonest manager is threatened with loss. That's where his perspective starts. He's going to lose his job. We all know what that means. Some of us have lived through that. And even if after a long time where you feel like you ended up in a better place, you still don't remember that experience fondly, it's not much fun. So it's interesting, only when he faces the loss of his job, his reputation, his wealth, his home, does he change his ways. And he's not changing his ways for entirely selfless motives here. He's changing them in order to try to help himself later on down the road. You know, it's like Luke's Jesus is saying, whatever it takes to get you to repent is okay. If you think it's going to help you down the road, God will work with that. You don't have to be totally altruistic to turn it around. The dishonest manager is squandering the rich man's resources. We don't know whether it's mismanagement or embezzlement. Luke doesn't tell us. But he responds to the impending loss of his job by reducing the amount that people have to pay to settle up. And the commentaries tell us that this would, in effect, be cutting out his take. So he doesn't get what he would normally get as the middleman in the transaction. He's just cutting his losses in the hopes that they will remember how they gained from that when he's on the streets, without a home, without a job, experiencing loss. It's hard to know what to say to people who have experienced loss, isn't it? It's something that we all fear. Nobody wants to go through it. So it's hard to speak with compassion. It's hard to be with somebody who's in that place because it touches our own fear and our own discomfort with the whole idea. So the dishonest manager is cutting his losses in hopes that his friends who remember this will kind of get over their discomfort and be kind to him. And it's worth noting, those of you who are students of this gospel, that the parable immediately preceding this one is the prodigal son. And if you remember that story, the prodigal son does not repent and return to the father because he's really sorry for all the harm that he caused. Remember the reason, right? He wants to eat better and live better than he could on his own. There's a lot of self-interest in both of these parables that are leading these people to change their ways. And I think Luke's Jesus is being really compassionate for us and realizing we don't have to completely take ourselves out of the equation, berate ourselves when we get it wrong, and try to turn around and do it better. God means to prosper us too. God means to grow our gifts. And loss and repentance are very interesting ways in which God manages to pull that off. So in both these passages, the losses occur after people have put their trust into something other than God. This isn't a lesson about greed. It's not about wealth. It's about idolatry. It's about what John Calvin says we all do all the time, make idols. We turn to it again and again, our money, our security, to see a vision for our future. Because it's much easier to see what money can give us for our future than it is for what God can give us. This is why the mission study and the vision statement take so long. It's harder to see, to turn to God, to ask God to help us discern what our vision should be apart from what the world gives us. And it's not a thing that we can be complacent about. We don't have all the time in the world to figure this out, folks. I think one of the interesting things about the dishonest manager is the urgency. Immediately, he sets about settling these accounts. The loss is getting ready to happen. And Jeremiah laments that the people didn't realize how close they were to losing everything. If you knew how close it was, how would you change what you do? Hear that question through these scriptures. We're all going to lose everything one day. And we're going to have many losses along the way. How does that change what we do with what we have? Because sometimes we need to lose what we have in order to gain what God gives. You know, I don't tell many people this, at least in this way, that as an atheist, when I lost everything and was really brought to my knees, no job, no house, no marriage, it had been a rough ride. As an atheist, I tried to construct a worldview that I could live into and support and make everything work, and it just failed miserably. And then after my faith in God was restored, from that day to this, everything in my life, that big level came into my life, God in the center, and everything physically, emotionally, spiritually, materially, relationally got so much better. And I don't say that because I don't believe in the prosperity gospel. I don't believe that if you have faith, that will happen to you. I don't want to preach that. I don't know why it happened, but I do believe that idolatry takes the life out of us. And as soon as we begin that journey of trying to discern where we're putting our hope for security, that's going to fail because it's not God. And we learn that just trying to put our security in God will not fail us. Abundant life begins. The peace that passes all understanding. The wisdom to know that what we have is by grace. What we know of God is only given by grace because it's free and comes from a God we cannot really see. It's easy to take it for granted and to find something more secure, more material to put our faith in. Sometimes we need to lose what we have to gain what God has to give us. So I want to end with a story about last week's finance meeting. Those of you who are still awake will probably want to fall asleep now. Many of you who remember when I first arrived here 2 years ago, well, those of you who were on the session at the time, will remember that the session came to me along with our two treasurers and said, Marguerite, we want to form a finance committee. That's one of the first things you need to help us do. So I did, which entailed trying to learn all I could about the financial history and books here. And found the endowment funds that have been given through the years. And as soon as I started trying to do this work, there were some people who thought I was going after those trust funds to spend every cent. And in some sense, that perception was correct. But I am here to tell you, after 2 years, the endowment funds are largely intact. Churches with endowments these days, Presbyterian churches in particular, have growing endowments and very often memberships that are not growing. And they can become gripped by fear of becoming the dishonest manager, of squandering all that's been given by these generous, faithful, and loving members over the years. I want to tell you something. Every committee meeting that I attend, the most contentious arguments, I use that word carefully, the most invigorating discussions occur over how to spend your hard-earned pledges and how faithful we can be to the intention of the original donors of these funds. No other topic receives as much attention in these committee meetings. And the people in the committees, your session, are weighing competing needs that are so many they know that they cannot answer them all. How can you choose one over the other? There's loss and there's hurt and there's misunderstanding everywhere. And then what if they make a bad decision and end up squandering the money in spite of their best intentions? They sweat these decisions, your leadership in this church. And I'm sure you all never have similar conversations at home about what you think the money ought to be spent on. These are easy things, right? We are afraid of loss. We are afraid. But loss happens to all of us. And the good news in all this that we're hearing in these scriptures is that God will be in the loss, and God works through the loss that will give us something else to prosper us in some unexpected way. The loss doesn't go away, the pain doesn't, the trauma doesn't, but there is something for us in it. We can trust that God has compassion for us and uses loss to give us ways to grow in compassion for others. That is no small thing, you guys. Compassion is having a hard time in our age. So when the session makes a financial decision that you disagree with, you're free to speak with the elders or with me. And you're also free to grow in compassion for the difficulty that that decision had and all the work that the session did in trying to make it. When someone you know experiences loss because they made a bad decision and life came down hard on them, you are free to learn from their mistakes. And you're also free to grow in your compassion for the way that even sometimes the smallest mistake seems to bring down consequences that are outsized. And grow in compassion for that experience. In a few minutes, we'll be taking up the offering. And our Community Outreach Committee has, after struggle and discussion, decided to put our Peace and Global Witness portion of that offering, which is an annual offering we do in the Peace USA every year, toward Hurricane Dorian relief. We'll start taking it today, just designate it as such, because there's compassion for people who have lost everything. And when you experience a loss because you made a bad decision or because you simply happen to be in the path of an oncoming storm, and people don't seem to have much compassion for you, you are free to forgive them and see firsthand how much the world needs compassion, how difficult compassion is hard, or how difficult it is to come by compassion, that we need it maybe even more than money. So if spending a little money and losing a little wealth creates a little more compassion for each other in our faith community, and then in the world out there, more compassion for those poor folks who are just trying to do the best they can in a life that's increasingly challenging, I think it's possible. Even the finance committee might be able to discern ways in which we can actually make mammon serve God. I think we're willing to serve. The question is, who and how? It's good work that these committees are doing on your behalf. It's good work that the session is doing at this time of transition. And I think God is blessing our efforts to make sure that God is in the center of all that we're doing here and not anything else, not anybody's other vision or agenda. And that is the good news. You think? The good news from Jeremiah. The good news from the dishonest manager. God meaning to prosper us all, no matter what we have to lose to gain that. Amen.